Good evening, dear friends. As you have seen today, we have gathered here to discuss about the poetry of T.S. Eliot, who is the prominent writer, essayist, poet, and he has been prescribed in MEG1, that is British poetry. As you all are appearing for the examination for MEG1 in the coming session, so today we are discussing on his important poems and the writer at large. So today we have Professor Nandini Sahu, who is an eminent poet herself and who has written a lot of books. Her poetry has been translated into multiple languages in our country, and her books are being taught in different countries as well. So in order to discuss about the poet like T.S. Eliot, I requested her and she gave her kind permission. So we are here, Professor Nandini Sahu, and we will have some questions, and definitely these questions are going to help you for the examination. So let us begin our today's discussion. So welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
So as T.S. Eliot, we know that he was a renowned poet, essayist, and publisher. He wrote some dramas as well. So, madam, there is a question which comes from our students that they want to know what is the contribution of T.S. Eliot in English literature, and I request you to please introduce T.S. Eliot and his poetry for giving the wider understanding to our students.
Right. Thank you for inviting me to this program, to this very important discussion. Hello, learners. We will talk, coming 30 minutes, we are going to talk to you about the contributions of T.S. Eliot, not just as a poet, as Dr. Prashant has already told you, that he was a poet, he was a critic, he was a theorist, he was a dramatist, he was an editor. You know, he had many hats to his credit. So we will talk about the multiple aspects of T.S. Eliot's personality and his poetry. And I'm very, very fascinated with the lines, the very striking and important lines that T.S. Eliot has written in his multiple essays and criticisms. About T.S. Eliot, the best thing I would like to say is the poetry theory symbiosis. You know, you cannot really distinguish T.S. Eliot the poet from T.S. Eliot the critic and the theorist. When he was writing his poetry, the literary theory, the criticism that he wrote on several occasions would definitely get into his poetry. And when he was writing his literary criticisms and his theories, the theoretical essays and debates, when he was writing all those things, he wrote that sometimes more often in a very plural and poetic language. So you cannot actually distinguish who from the who. The T.S. Eliot, the poet, the dramatist, T.S. Eliot, the critic, the theorist. So in this discussion, Dr. Prashant and I, we would be giving you so many aspects of T.S. Eliot's poetry and also the most probable questions, the possible questions in the term and examination and the assignments that are there in your IGNOU website, and also in the UGC NET examination, the kind of questions that we usually give from T.S. Eliot, we will be talking to you about that. When I tell you about the UGC NET examination, let me put it on record here that in our English NET examination, one major portion definitely deals with T.S. Eliot's poetry, criticism and drama. And also there is another UGC NET examination on IKS, Indian Knowledge Systems. And under that Indian Knowledge Systems UGC NET examination, there are 10 units. And the unit 10 deals with the Western philosophers, critics and writers who were inherently influenced by Indian knowledge systems, and T.S. Eliot appears in that. So isn't it a welcome fact and a very interesting thing for all of us that T.S. Eliot is not just taught in the English departments or also in the American literature departments, but also under the IKS, under the Indian knowledge systems. Today, in the beginning, in the first part of this discussion, me and Dr. Prashant, we would be talking to you about the poetry of T.S. Eliot in general, and also I would like to quote a few interesting and very important lines of T.S. Eliot vis-a-vis his literary criticism, and then Dr. Prashant will talk to you about Indian knowledge systems in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. We have decided like that. In the meantime, if you have any questions or queries, you have our numbers. Please get in touch with us. Well, when I said that I will be quoting some very striking and important lines of T.S. Eliot, the first one is Eliot was, he introduced the modernist movement. I would, if not introduced, at least he was one of the most important critiques and a person with deep engagement with the modernist movement. So one question that usually we give you in our term and examinations is discuss T.S. Eliot as a modernist poet or the person who introduced the modernist movement, something like that. So play around that idea, T.S. Eliot as a modernist, is it? Okay. And then one of the quotations from T.S. Eliot essays, usually we give that as a part of your question paper, that no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must see him for contrast and comparison among the dead. Well, probably in this portion, he talks about the historiography of any writer. You have to distinguish between history and historiography. The history of a writer may be the geographical, the topographical history of a writer. But when we talk about the tradition and also the individual talent of a poet, then we talk about the historiography that he or she belongs to. So in this case, somehow I feel, maybe it's my very personal feeling, that T.S. Eliot, he talks about new criticism. I mean, he is one poet who has strongly supported new criticism. But at the same time, here and there, I find the ideas of the reader response in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. So one question we usually give you is, do you think that T.S. Eliot belonged to the school of thought of the new criticism or to the reader response? So probably you should look at that and start preparing that on the basis of the poem that you have in your syllabus. Now, coming to Longinus and the essay on the sublime. Longinus talks about sublimity and the status, the standard, the high quality of poetry. Somehow I feel a parallel between Longinus and T.S. Eliot when Eliot says that talent is required through a careful study of poetry, claiming that tradition cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. So when Longinus says that there should be high quality, high standard of a poet inherently in him or her, T.S. Eliot also more or less, he talks about that, doesn't it? And then this morning when Dr. Prashant was telling me something about this quotation, I immediately jotted down something very, very interesting when T.S. Eliot says, immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Well,
right.
So would you like to say about that?
I was astonished while reading this line.
Right.
And how can a poet of this stature says that poet can steal? We are stealing somewhere connects us with
plagiarism.
Plagiarism, and
Okay.
whereas the poets cannot be plagiarist.
Okay.
So
Okay.
in that respect.
Okay, exactly. Dear students, he was not really talking about plagiarism. I mean, he was not promoting plagiarism per se. So when he said immature poets imitate, mature poets steal, probably he meant intertextuality and polyphony. In the age of intertextuality and polyphony, and in the period of, say, new historicism, when we are reading two texts parallelly, probably he meant that mature poets steal not words or ideas or languages, but maybe a school of thought. Maybe try to belong to a school of thought. Probably that's what he meant. And then another very interesting thing, usually in the examination we give you this question, talk about T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonality. And then try to apply that to the poem in your syllabus. That question we usually give you. In the theory of impersonality, what Eliot says, the mind of the writer is like a receptacle. and in which the writer has to store a number of varied feelings, emotions, and experiences. So the mind of the poet is a receptacle. He talks about some kind of a chemical process. So in a chemical process, like I have also taken down that one, referring to the scientific analogy, Eliot discusses the vital role of the mind of a poet. He says that when you write poetry, some kind of chemical reaction takes place in your mind. He says that the combination of oxygen and sulfur dioxide produces sulfurous acid. But then, for the smooth and successful conduct of the chemical reaction, the presence of a filament of platinum is a must. So, a shred of platinum, a piece of platinum is a must for this chemical reaction. Similarly, the mind of the poet, according to T.S. Eliot, is like that shred of platinum. Inputs and outputs. Suppose I look at something beautiful. For example, I look at a beautiful flower, or I look at a beautiful river for that matter. And then I store that beauty in my mind. And then the next moment, the output can be poetry. And in the process of my feeling for that flower and my expression in the black and white, my mind should not undergo any change. The poet's mind is like a shred of platinum in the chemical process of production of poetry. Well, I have my share of problems with this. When T.S. Eliot talks in favor of the theory of impersonality and the maybe the lack of involvement of the poet in the process of the chemical process of creation of poetry, but can you ever claim that any poet in the world, in any part of the world, can write poetry where he or she is not engaged or involved in the chemical process? I doubt that. See, for example, T.S. Eliot's poem, Gerontion. In the poem Gerontion, which is one of his simple and nice good poems, it's a feel-good poem. In that poem, the person, the protagonist, Gerontion, he stands for T.S. Eliot. He is very, very personal there, that during the World War, whatever things were going in his mind, the frustration, the death, the decadence, the bloodshed, whatever was going around in the society, Eliot was feeling rather frustrated. And the character Gerontion, he expressed the inner self, the mind of the poet himself, the mind of the poet T.S. Eliot himself. So when Eliot talks about the theory of impersonality and the poet's mind being a catalyst, he writes poetry where you can find a reflection of his personality. Well, another poem, if you look at Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he says that let us go then you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Before T.S. Eliot wrote that kind of a modernist poem, maybe this is the first ever modernist poem in British literature or in world literature, you can say. Before that, in almost all the poems, the imagery, the allusions, the comparisons, the metaphors, the similes were like a lover would invite a lady to go to a beautiful place, maybe to the moon, maybe to a garden, or maybe to something very beautiful. But here, the lover is asking the lady to go to the operation table, to go to some evening when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. So, you can actually see it, that there is some surgery going on and a patient is lying on the table and his body is wide open, and you can find that kind of an imagery. So, I somehow see the bloodshed of the world wars were reflecting in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. So, I feel that T.S. Eliot, the powerful critique, the powerful poet, the man of letters, he wrote very many things, and somewhere, somehow, at some places, he contradicted himself, which is quite natural. We will not be dismissive about the great poet, the great critique, just because somewhere, as readers, we find that he contradicts himself, isn't it? And then another part is where he talks about art may be said to approach the condition of science. This is a very controversial statement he has given in one of the criticisms, that art may be said to approach the condition of science. Now, the condition of science is very logical. Science has to justify everything, prove everything. And when it is arts, one has to go by the heart. One has to go by the emotions. But he somehow tries to amalgamate the two of them. And he says that poetry is not a turning loose of emotions, but an escape from emotions. Now, how can poetry be an escape from emotions? Well, you have to justify that. We give you this question that talk about the poem in your syllabus vis-a-vis this idea that poetry is not a turning loose of emotions, but an escape from emotions. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from the personality of the poet. So this is one thing that we usually give you. And that is how T.S. Eliot says that Wordsworth's theory of poetry is inexact. I'm quoting inexact. When Wordsworth says that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, T.S. Eliot says that this is inexact. He problematizes the theory of poetry of William Wordsworth. And also T.S. Eliot says that the social function of poetry should have a universal appeal. Poetry has to be universal. Poetry that is subjective, poetry that is intimately personal may not be universal poetry. Here, you can also create a criticism that in T.S. Eliot's poetry, like Gerontion or like Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, or many other poems like The Wasteland, which Dr. Prashant will discuss with you now, a lot of personal imagery has been used. His images, his metaphors, the similes that T.S. Eliot uses are really very, very intimately personal. That's why he gives a lots of notes and references in his poetry. Even at the end of every poem, you will find a notes section where he talks about the metaphors, the ideas, the imagery that he was taking from different parts of the world. And in this case, he was taking a lot from India. He had a Sanskrit teacher. He had a teacher who taught him Sanskrit language, and that is how he got influenced by the Bhagavad Gita, which reflects very clearly in 4 quartets and also in this poem that you have in your syllabus. And then T.S. Eliot talks about Walt Whitman, Song of Myself. The great poet in writing of himself writes his age. Walt Whitman somewhere wrote that I sing of myself, I celebrate myself, for the autumn belonging to me as good belongs to you. Similarly, T.S. Eliot says that a poet, when he writes himself, he actually writes his age. That means the period that he belongs to, he writes. And another quote from T.S. Eliot, which is again a part of your question, poetry is a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. So any poem, for example, if I write a short poem to T.S. Eliot, this is a living whole of all the poems that have ever been written in the historiography of poetry. So he tries to connect the poet with his history, with his past. And the progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. How striking lines. Well, I agree to that. When you are a writer, you have to leave your personality a bit. You have to leave your ego, you have to leave your alter ego, everything. And then it's a continuous extinction of your personality. You get into your character, isn't it? And then he described his criticism as a byproduct of my poetry workshop. So his criticism, he was questioned a lot about the kind of criticism he was writing. He has written multiple criticisms. I will also come to that. And the question is, Eliot's impersonal theory of poetry is the greatest theory on the nature of the poetic process after Wordsworth's romantic conception of poetry. So this question we usually give you. After Wordsworth's romantic conception of poetry, if something new came up, in the form of new criticism, or if something came up in the part of modern poetry, then this is T.S. Eliot, two powerful people. That's what we discuss. And about T.S. Eliot's poetic drama, only poetic drama can be artistic. Realistic prose drama is bad, very bad art. He used to say such very, powerful lines. Sometimes he would be dismissive. He had his strong likes and dislikes. And if he wanted to say something about somebody, some critic, some author, he definitely did that without any doubt. Like about objective correlative. He dismissed Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, that it lacks objective correlative. And if he wanted to write something about somebody, he promptly did that. And then he wrote, from time to time, it is desirable that some critique should appear to review the past of our literature and set the poets and the poems in a new order. Here I am reminded about Alexander Pope, who says that old order changeth, yielding place to new. So new order should come up. In this quote, in one of the essays, T.S. Eliot says that from time to time, any critique or any poet should come and dismiss or discuss everything that has been written and then create new order in poetry. So this is what you find in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. If you see his early poetry and his later poetry, the poetry that he wrote in America and the poetry that he wrote in England, I think in his mid-40s, he shifted from America to England and he took the citizenship, and then he wrote Ash Wednesday, the poem which was under a lot of controversy. So you also see in the poetry of T.S. Eliot, there is a sea change in the style, in the technique, in the thematic approach, everything that he wrote. There was a sea change. There was a very striking shift from some kind of poetry which was a bit of personal to a kind of poetry which was very much oriented with myth and folklore. I would say myth. Let us not go to folklore. We need another class to discuss folklore. Let's talk about the myth. So Indian mythology, Indian knowledge systems, he used that extensively. And then he was deeply influenced by Matthew Arnold and Aristotle. He was very, very supportive, appreciative of Aristotle. And he said, our classic, the classic of entire Europe is Virgil. He was very appreciative of Virgil. So this question can also come for you, that the influence of Virgil in the poetry of T.S. Eliot, with reference to the poem in your syllabus, discuss that it can be there. And conceptual symbols and emotional preferences were the ideas with which he wrote so many essays. And then he said that poetry should be neither pedantic nor vulgar. Vulgar means probably he meant poetry which is not of a high style, of a grandeur. And by pedantic, probably he meant that poetry should not be preaching. Rather, poetry should be entertaining, while the deep internal message should be there, like oxygen in water. Probably he meant that. You have to deconstruct T.S. Eliot. You have to understand his personal imagery. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of information about the criticism that T.S. Eliot has written on general topics. He wrote on criticism and theory, tradition, romanticism and classicism, religion and literature. And then on poetry and drama, he wrote the poetic process, impersonality and poetry, objective correlative, unified sensibility, form and poetic drama, the actor and personality, the auditory imagination. And under the individual authors, he wrote about many authors, but majorly his focus was on authors like Ben Jonson, Matthew Arnold and Thomas Hardy. So this is a very, very basic and general introduction that I gave you about poetry. Now maybe Dr. Prashant would like to take over, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. And in fact, you raised a very important issue, that theory of impersonality, and you were not agreeing with this concept.
Yeah.
In fact, what I believe, that theory of impersonality, somewhere it has a reference of Indian philosophy.
Okay.
Where he might have read, he definitely read Bhagavad Gita, Ashtavakra Gita, in which the protagonists talk about the detachment from the worldly things.
Right.
So theory of impersonality might have come from that concept.
Okay.
And is one of the famous poem which is responsible, which is the reason for giving him this Nobel Prize.
Right.
And this is Wasteland.
Right.
In the poem like Wasteland, he used a lot of myths, and which has an abundance of references from different scriptures, different mythologies.
Right.
And out of these all mythologies, Indian mythology and Indian references are at the higher number.
Right.
So I would like to quote the last stanzas,
right,
which have been taken from his last chapter from this Wasteland. Right. And its name is What the Thunder Said. Right. The Wasteland has 5 different cantos, out of which the last one is very significant as far as the Indian philosophy is concerned. Right. So the lines start like Ganga, right, and very beautifully, I would appreciate here that Ganga, he has not used it as a Ganges. Like mostly Britishers use Ganges,
right,
but he used the exact term Ganga.
Okay.
That is showing his affinity towards Indian philosophy,
right,
and the Sanskrit literature and Sanskrit words as they are available in the language. So he used the language like Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant. Here again, he did not use some another similar word for Himavant. He used the exact word what is available in our Sanskrit scriptures.
Right.
So he has used the myth of Prajapati and his three pupils,
Right.
gods, sons, and demons.
Right.
So he has given the instruction for all his three
Right.
pupils.
Right.
So the line start like Datta,
Huh.
what have you given?
Huh.
My friend, blood shaking my heart, the
Right.
awful daring of moment surrender,
Right.
which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only we have existed.
Right.
Here in these lines he has somewhere he has the pain which has come after the hecatomb of World War II, World War First,
Right.
and he has also felt a lot of pain because of the downfall of the European civilization,
Right.
because of too much use of materialistic
Right.
materialistic things. So the poem goes further, and he gave the another solution to the problem, that is through Dayadham. Dayadham here for be compassionate for the people who need it.
Right.
So in which he wrote like, I have heard the key, turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in its prison.
Right.
Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison.
Right.
Only at nightfall, ethereal rumors revive for a moment a
Right.
broken coralliness. Here he has given the suggestion to the humankind
Right.
that we must have the compassion for the people who are really downtrodden, who are having some pains, and we have to feel their pain empathetically.
Right.
So the third solution he has given to the humankind for making the world livable, that is Damyata. Damyata means to control our desires, because desires are endless. So because he had recently seen the impact of World War One and the impact of atom bomb.
True.
So he might have felt that it is required to be controlled in one's desires. So he wrote like, the boat responded gaily to the hand expert with the sail and roar. Likewise, the poem continues, and
Right.
very interestingly, that poem ends not with the English words, but from the words of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad,
Right.
which is one of the prominent texts from our Indian scripture.
Right.
And the poem ends like Datta Dayadham Damyata Shanti Shanti Shanti. So here his masterpiece Wasteland ends with the Indian scripture. So here we can see that he has an influence of Indian philosophy in his
Right.
poetry. And he found the resort in Indian philosophy for making the world peaceful and happy and livable lives.
True.
So thank you very much, ma'am, that we came here, and the insights which students took from you and the examples which you have given, you have in fact capsuled T.S. Eliot and his works, and our students are definitely going to be benefited in his in their exams.
Right.
And not only for the exams, but they will also get the insight to write their own poetry, and they will learn something from the very important poet what we discussed today, T.S. Eliot.
Right.
And thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.